Hello, I'm Chris Anderson. Welcome to the TED Interview, the podcast that we describe usually as taking a deeper dive with a TED speaker. And for today's guest, that description couldn't be more appropriate, actually, because I'm speaking with none other than her deepness, Sylvia Earle, an iconic marine scientist. She's known widely and affectionately by that title just because she's spent so much time exploring the ocean's depths. 10 years ago, TED awarded Sylvia the TED Prize to honor and support her work on behalf of the ocean.
I wish you would use all means at your disposal to ignite public support for a global network of marine protected areas, hope spots, large enough to save and restore the ocean, the blue heart of the planet. Now is the time.
The talk she gave that day was so inspiring that a philanthropist in the audience wrote her a check for $1 million on the spot. That money allowed the creation of an initiative called Mission Blue, which has continued to have impact to this day, as we'll hear. But first, I just want to say, Sylvia, welcome.
Great to be on board and to dive in. Yes, that's where I like to be, deep.
Sylvia, I want to ask you a question that my mother told me I should never ask a woman. Can you tell me the year you were born?
1935. There were only 2 billion people on the planet at the time. Consider the changes since then.
So you are, as we speak, you're 83 years old, and yet you continue as this force of nature, traveling the world, speaking passionately about the oceans. You're everywhere. Yesterday you were in Monaco. How do you do this?
Any way you can. You know, people ask me, do you still dive? And I say, well, I still breathe. So, of course, I still dive. And everyone should.
I've seen you dive. I've seen you in the water just a couple of years ago. And you were like this shimmying dolphin. I mean, it's so graceful and extraordinary to see you swim. It really feels as if this is your home.
Well, all of us are sea creatures when you think about it. All of us need the ocean. Every bit as much as the dolphins and the whales and the sharks and the coral reefs. No ocean, no life, no blue, no green.
Well, I want to hear you make the case for that a bit later on. But let's start with you as a little girl. I'm curious about your first exposure to the ocean.
Oh, well, it was on a New Jersey shore when I got knocked over by a wave. The ocean got my attention. But what has held my attention and keeps me going back as often as possible, it's life in the ocean. It's endlessly fascinating.
When was the first time you got to actually dive in and see what was down there?
Well, it really started on the Jersey Shore, getting acquainted with those big craggy horseshoe crabs that are unlike anything on the land or freshwater.
So you went in with wearing a snorkel or something like that? Or?
No, I just splashing around as a kid. In Florida, I met my first face mask. And to be able to see underwater makes all the difference. Our eyes are not naturally designed for being able to see underwater. You know, you open even in a swimming pool, everything is blurry. But in the ocean with the salt, it's hard to keep your eyes open. But for a fish or for a dolphin, a whale, even the seabirds have adaptations that make clear vision underwater possible. But we can emulate that with a face mask. It's just magic.
So tell me about one of those early dives that you remember still. Like, what was the experience? What did you see and what did you feel?
Well, I think the first time I had a chance to use scuba was offshore in the Gulf of Mexico. It was the summer of 1953. I was taking a class in marine biology, one of the first classes that anybody could take because it wasn't offered as an option.
So this was you as an 18-year-old?
It was actually before my birthday, so I think I was 17, but whatever. I was a teenager. And I had 2 words of instruction: breathe naturally. I thought, really, breathing underwater? Well, okay, I'll give it a try. Breathe naturally. And at first it seemed impossible, but then you can do it. Just take a breath, and there you are, underwater. And it was a little fish. It was a little damselfish that was in 15 feet of water. And before snorkeling, I could go down and say hi and then go back, but I could stay and I could just sit there underwater and observe this creature who was as curious about me, it turns out, as I was about it, or him or her, I'm not sure. But being able to have that gift of time to engage and to be engaged, it was that interaction that really makes a difference. You're not just bouncing in, bouncing out, looking at as you fly by, but you have a chance to have a conversation.
When was scuba even invented?
Well, Jacques Cousteau and Émile Gagnan really teamed up with solving the problem about how do you actually regulate the pressure of air that you breathe as you descend into the sea. Other efforts had been made before, but they're first to really make it practical and to make it accessible to the public at large.
And was that round about then, just a few years before?
In the
then?
40s.
In the 40s, yeah.
I mean, before then, people had been using copper diving helmets to descend into the depths, but to be free of hoses, to be able to just be out there cruising around on your own, makes all the difference.
One of the things that stunned me when I first dived, which was, I'm sorry to say, many decades later, but was just the scale of the ocean. Like many kids, I'd actually grown up seeing a lot of Jacques Cousteau on sort of black and white television, and it felt fascinating and amazing. But it was this little flat, visual. Right. You go down there, and yes, the color takes your breath away. But the scale, like on a clear day, this world of mountains and valleys and these sort of verdant coral reefs and so forth. I mean, that was what shocked me most, that you could just rotate and be surrounded 360, and as far as the eye could see, in every direction, there was something wonderful.
And different from what you see on the land, and yet connected, because the variations on the theme of life have a common chemistry. And what exists above the sea is really here because of life in the ocean. The greatest diversity and abundance of life is out there in the sea. In a single glassful of ocean water, there can be tens of thousands of individual kinds of microbes and millions of individual bodies.
Tens of thousands of species, millions of actual organisms in a glass.
Yeah.
I'm holding a glass right here and feeling a little queasy at the thought. But this is
fresh water, and while there probably surely are microbes in that glass of water too, there's nothing like the richness of life in the sea. And it's not like yuck, I don't want to be swimming in that. It's like, yes, you're swimming in life.
It's magical.
It's a living minestrone. It keeps us alive. One of your TED Talks was by Penny Chisholm. Chisholm found the smallest living cell that exists on the planet, Prochlorococcus, as much as 10% of the oxygen generated by all of the creatures that do generate oxygen, driven by this little creature, Prochlorococcus, that wasn't even known until the mid-1980s. What else don't we know that's out there that keeps us alive?
So, Sylvia, tell us a bit about your university days and studying and getting deeper into this. I mean, there weren't that many women scientists around at the time.
No.
Tell us about that. What was that like?
Again, it was not a question about people thought it was unusual, but I didn't care. It's what I had to do. And some say, well, wasn't it difficult being in classes where you were the only girl, or to go on expeditions where you were the only woman? And one notable one was in 1964, where I went to the Indian Ocean for weeks at sea with 70 men, and I was the only woman. And a reporter said, Sylvia sails away with 70 men, but she expects no problems. But I ask men sometimes, so if you had to go to sea with 70 women, would you think that's a problem? Anyway, the thing is, keep a sense of humor. Don't ask for favors. Stay on point as a scientist. And, you can get away with a lot.
I mean, you very quickly won everyone's respect. Like early on, you were appointed to lead some really unusual expeditions. Wasn't there an undersea expedition where you stayed underwater with a group of women for a week, wasn't it?
2 weeks. It was 1970. And there were a lot of objections on the part of the crusty Navy personnel. And it was the head of the program, James Miller, who I think had a good marriage and had daughters. And he said, well, half the fish are female. Maybe we can put up with a few women. And they hadn't expected women to apply. And when some of us did, and our credentials were every bit as good as those of the men who applied, they had to face up to, well, should we or should we not have women? And it was kind of a bold decision at the time to say, okay, but having men and women living together underwater was not considered acceptable. They actually said there could be hanky-panky on the reef. So we can't do this. But, men and women were flying on airplanes, were working in offices, were doing all sorts of things side by side. Why not underwater? And that was the rationale that I think kicked it over the edge and allowed that at least to have a team of women aquanauts, except they did not call us aquanauts. They called us aqua belles and aqua chicks and even aqua naughties. Again, the sense of humor. The NASA personnel, in the end, were surprised that we not only did as well as the men, but exceeded in some areas. We weren't trying to do so, but we had such a good time.
Well, tell me about, what was it actually like to live underwater for 2 weeks?
It was the gift of time to be able to, day and night, go in and out of your little underwater dwelling and get to know individual fish, to recognize their faces, to see the individual behaviors, to see how that group of angelfish stick together like a group of buddies swimming around together by day, to see the butterfly fish that actually tend to mate for life, like some people, and look at the barracuda, not just as, oh, barracuda, but that barracuda, different from that one over there. Some are more curious, others are more reserved, they stay behind. Or the sharks, they all have faces, they all have personality. And while some sober-sided scientists would say, as they did to Jane Goodall, what, you can't look at those chimpanzees as individuals, you can't give them names, that's unscientific. But it's just a fact. They are different. They do have personalities. You might as well face up to it and use that as a part of understanding who they are, who we are, and how we all are part of a single interacting system that we call life on Earth.
So this is so interesting because on the one hand, what you're saying is like literally from a scientific point of view, each fish has a unique DNA makeup.
Absolutely, like a fingerprint, like all of us.
And we don't think of fish that way. Most people think fish, those are those things that go around in those huge schools, and we don't think of them as individuals. And it seems like this experience you had where, to actually recognize different faces on these creatures is extraordinary.
Chris, people say, I've heard this so many times, fish don't feel pain. They intellectually don't have the capacity to feel pain. Well, excuse me. Put a hook in your mouth, and what would you do? You do exactly what a fish does. Of course they feel pain. I say intellectually it's inconceivable that we would think otherwise, knowing they're fellow vertebrates. They have a backbone, we have backbone. We've got a brain, they've got brains. I once experienced, while living underwater in the Florida Keys with a fellow scientist who was charged with trying to figure out what it is that gets fish to come in and out of fish traps, whether they have bait inside to lure them inside of a trap or not. And I agreed to work with him to tag some of the fish so we could, even though you can recognize individuals, this was like a scientific security issue. That if you tag a fish, you know for sure that it was that fish that came in and out of a fish trap. Anyway, we went out at night, and I stood by while he extracted a big grouper from one of the fish traps and tried to insert a tag. This means poking a tag in the flesh of the fish that would be a part of the fish for the rest of its life. And the fish was not having it. Oh, he was so unhappy, squirming around and making fish sounds, most fish do make sounds. This one was going, as my friend Billy Causey was trying to put the tag in it. And finally, I just said no. I just stopped the whole process. And when we got back to our little underwater lab, I said, Billy, I will continue to work with you to tag the fish on one condition, that for every fish tag you put in a fish, you put one in yourself.
Wow.
I mean, that was...
And did that... I'm guessing he didn't sign up for that deal.
No, we stopped tagging them after that. But anyway, I don't know. It's just, we're so insensitive to them.
Let's continue to build this case, because I think it's really interesting. At one level, we don't understand consciousness, so we don't fully understand what pain is. But there's so much evidence that suggests, in humans, it is always associated with a nerve ending being stimulated, electrical signals traveling to the brain. There's a center in the brain that processes it. We feel pain, and there's an obvious evolutionary reason for it, which is to stop doing that. What you were doing, pull your hand out of the candle or whatever it is.
And it's evolved over a very long. I mean, even some of the creatures that we regard as the most simple, sponges. Now, they don't have a nervous system, but touch it anywhere and the whole system shuts down.
Do some scientists try to argue that what you're actually seeing is more like a sort of an instinctive, or, it's the same as you shine a light into a piece of water and certain organisms just naturally sort of follow the light or whatever. There's not necessarily emotion associated with it. Do some try and make that argument that the brains are fundamentally different? Like, in some ways it seems... When you see actual fish behavior, like when they're swimming along peacefully, a predator comes, they take off like a bat out of hell. Why wouldn't that be associated with a feeling of fear?
Well, exactly. I mean, it's a survival that they anticipate what the consequences might be if they don't move quickly out and away.
I think a lot of us are definitely at the point where we will attribute other mammals and other animals that we eat the ability to feel pain, and we feel guilty about that. But a lot of people are in complete denial on fish. It's like, please don't make me worry about that as well. That's too much worry. I can't handle that.
Look, they've been around for hundreds of millions of years. And probably much of what we now have is what we treasure as being human has been derived from that hundreds of millions of years of our predecessors that have given us what we now think of as uniquely ours, but it isn't uniquely ours. It's had a long history, and it's still there in the creatures who are all around us. And we should respect that, not be demeaned or diminished by it, but feel that, thank you, fish, thank you, birds, thank you, frogs, thank you, all life on Earth, because we're all connected, and that we have maybe something special in terms of appreciating what we have. I mean, I think about our ability now to see the whole the way other creatures cannot. We have harnessed technology that can take us high in the sky and deep in the sea, and the technologies to communicate on a level that is unprecedented in not only the history of all of the rest of life on Earth, but in our own human history. Think of how long it has taken to get to the point where new discoveries can be integrated to be able to see the whole. I mean, elephants are really smart. We acknowledge that now. Dolphins, really smart. And they have social structure. But nothing like what we have acquired in recent decades that gives us an edge and also a responsibility that is unprecedented.
There's one other riddle just associated with what fish feel that I just want to ask your thought on, because it's really puzzled me. When I started diving, I looked around at this beauty that was down there that takes your breath away. And in one sense, this existed for hundreds of millions of years, these awesome undersea vistas. But I wondered whether anyone had actually appreciated it. Like, was it the case that actually during those hundreds of millions of years, the creatures down there got to experience some kind of aesthetic pleasure from it, just because there is so much variety, there is so much color, there is so much awesomeness down there? Do you have a view on that as to whether at least some submarine creatures have an aesthetic sense?
I would think it extraordinary if they didn't. I mean, I have seen dogs perched on the edge of a beach watching the sun go down. I mean, are they having fun? Are they really appreciating the magnificence of what's out there? Or are they just sitting there? I've seen dolphins leap out of the water, or even mobula rays. You can say, well, they're just trying to knock parasites off their back, or are they just having fun? Is it the pleasure of being a mobula ray? Is it the joy of being a dolphin? I can leap. I mean, I do it because I can. Or watching fish basking in a sunbeam.
And I think most evolutionary biologists would say that beauty itself, to the extent that you believe that things evolve for a reason, like it was intended to give us cues about what type of environments were wonderful for us. The things that people naturally find beautiful classically are supposed to be these scenes where there's water, there's greenery, there's safety, there's a sort of an interesting landscape. And so from that point of view, it would be plausible, for example, for certain fish to know that here is a coral reef, this is home.
Right.
Well, look at its majesty and to be drawn to it and not to be tempted to go somewhere else. There's an actual biological purpose for that.
Some of this we have, through scientific experimentation, linked to the chemistry, that there's a chemical signal and sounds. Also, there's a soundscape associated with a healthy coral reef. And sound in the ocean is so important because we don't live there. We're not as tuned in to how important it is, not just to marine mammals, but to fish and to crustaceans, to even the plankton in the ocean, that a noisy, healthy, chattering coral reef attracts or is like a homing signal, or the chemistry that emanates from a healthy, diverse coral reef, or in converse, the chemistry, the signals that come from a dead area. Avoid that place because it doesn't smell right. It doesn't sound right. But when we are attracted to aromas, the whole perfume industry is built around trying to build on that sense that we have in us, that other creatures have in them. The fresh smell of a forest as compared to the smell of a city. We have these things in common with other forms of life. We are not just all by ourselves in the splendor of life. We are connected, and our chemistry of life has roots that have evolved from all preceding life, if you will.
And if most people's sort of mental image, including mine of the ocean at its finest, is of a coral reef and the majesty that's there and the huge number of species that are there and so forth. But there's another whole world as you go deeper. And I wondered, Sylvia, you've got to dive deeper than almost anyone on the planet. Tell us about the first time you went down to a place where there was no light. What was that like?
Think about it. Most of life on Earth lives in the dark all of the time. All of life on Earth lives in the dark some of the time. But to live deeper than about 1,000 feet, and that's where most of life on Earth exists, and it's dark. So how about that? We are odd. We are in the minority. We live in a partially illuminated world.
And every evolutionary strategy of almost every creature that we think about is associated with light, with being able to see, whether, you see the animal you're trying to chase to eat, or you see the predator that's coming after you
sight is so important.
fly. It's so important for us.
To us. But the ocean, it's sound, and it's also tuned in to very low light illumination that is powered by bioluminescence, the firefly kind of light. Edie Widder also gave a TED Talk at one point and described how one of the most common forms of communication on the planet is through bioluminescence. And that is that the sparkle, flash, and glow that is uncommon on the surface. Most of life in the sea, in the deep sea, is able to either produce light, or they're certainly sensitive to that light, and they have exquisite adaptations to being able to sense this very low but very important level of light, and also forms of light that we don't register. This amazing creature called a stomatopod, a mantis shrimp, has the most remarkable eyes perhaps of any creature on the planet. Well, it's a big statement, but they can perceive ultraviolet light. They can perceive a spectrum of light much broader than what we can. And their eyes, they can operate independently. They have, I don't know, I could go on and on raving about.
But I'm so interested in these creatures. I mean, they like it's a whole other world of wonder down there. There's many worlds of wonder that are down there. It's not just the coral reefs, it's the plankton, all the microorganisms, it's this world of bioluminescence, it's the mystery of what's actually happening round about the ocean floor. And I mean, there's so much down there. And now it all seems in peril. And Sylvia, I'd love you to talk about, like, what were the early signs that became troubling to you about things going wrong, things that we were perhaps doing to our oceans?
You know, it probably started when I was just a little girl in New Jersey, but really began to grow living in Florida at a time when our population really grew from the world I knew, with 2 billion people, and by 1980 had doubled, and now we're seeing it almost doubling again. And the consequence of our impact on the world, the natural world, the places that I knew and loved as a kid, especially in Florida, to see clear water that I knew in high school as clear water no longer live up to its name because of turning Tampa Bay and the surrounding area into, you dredge the seafloor and you take what was shallow seagrass meadow and you turn it into a parking lot, you turn it into a housing development, you turn it into land that we build on, but you destroy what was a healthy ocean ecosystem in the process. And San Francisco Bay, a third of it is gone, converted into dry land to build skyscrapers. And look at New York City. Oh my goodness, so much of this beautiful, amazing part of human culture has come at the cost of what had been amazingly thriving oyster beds and productive marshes and seagrass meadows. I mean, we did not know. I mean, I cannot fault my predecessors who, in ignorance, weren't accounting for nature.
I imagine, for a long time, our whole picture of the natural world was just vastly bigger than us. And so building out from New York into other areas, I would imagine that even in someone who cared about the world, they would think, the ocean is so vast. It's so much more vast than this little space. Yes, we're displacing some oysters here, but they have the whole ocean. And of course, what we've seen in recent decades is that humans' impact has gone far, far, far beyond just the pieces of ocean that we've actually physically claimed.
Right.
And so talk about some of those impacts and when you became aware of them and what first got your attention.
A contemporary of Charles Darwin, Thomas Huxley, one of my heroes, one of the great scientists of our civilization, is a geologist, really wrote very, very compellingly about how there's no way that we could diminish the amount of fish in the ocean. We've grown up with this attitude that the ocean will yield whatever we want to take from it, and it can also accept whatever trash we want to put into it. And we've had this habit of taking our garbage and towing it out to sea and throwing it into the ocean because it just goes away. You can't see it anymore. But I began to see it by diving. I could begin to see the advance of what we were putting into the ocean, and now it's everywhere. I mean, from the little submarines going down thousands of feet beneath the surface, I always see trash, always. If people talk about the great ocean garbage patch out in the Pacific. Well, the whole ocean is our big garbage patch. And one of the big problems is that we don't see probably the worst of it, the plastic that is breaking up into tiny pieces, the microplastics. You don't see it, but it is there, getting integrated into the plankton.
So talk about that. Like, obviously it's distressing seeing garbage in the ocean. It's distressing seeing plastic wash up on beaches and so forth. But in terms of the pollutants that we're putting into the ocean, would you put plastic as the number one thing we should be worried about? And worried about because it stays there forever, but slowly breaks down into forms that can be ingested by fish, and then fish and dolphins, mammals, and so forth, and can kill them. Or how? Explain to me why plastic is such a problem.
Plastic is not the problem. We're the problem. It isn't these amazing new forms of materials that we have synthesized, but we haven't realized that single-use plastics don't really make sense, that there is no way, that we need to think about the synthetic materials that we generate, what's their full lifetime. These exotic materials that we put together, the miracles of chemistry to make synthetic materials, have toxins associated with them that are not good for life in the sea, and they're not good for us either. The plastic containers that we have, that we put juice and water and vegetables and things in, leak those chemicals, and they come back to harm us as well as life in the sea. We make choices. The fish and the other creatures have no choice. Right. They are the recipients of what we have done to their environment.
And do you have a recommendation? Like, is there one main approach that humans should be taking to prevent this? Is it basically about just changing the way that we regulate certain industries so that this stuff doesn't get into the ocean?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I do my best to work at the highest levels that I can, working with governments, working with any president I can catch along the way, to talk about their responsibility, their power, use of their power. But I also talk with those on the ground, whether it's a farmer or a fisherman, and I work with them. I mean, I worry more about legal fishing than I do about illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. It's the legal fishing. It's the concept, this perception that we have that it's okay to kill wildlife from the ocean on a mega scale. It's because the laws and the attitudes have not caught up with the reality. But if people can catch up with the reality, they can say, oh, so I understand that there are only 3% of bluefin tuna remaining in the Pacific based on the fishermen's own catch records and the scientific analysis. Wow, 3%. We better stop killing them, and I can do my part by not eating sushi.
Right.
Even if it's legal, and it is legal to take bluefin tuna by the ton, not even counting individual fish. We just think of them by the ton. And it's not right morally, but it takes the power of people. I like what Wild Aid says, when the buying stops, the killing can too.
So let's dive into this question of overfishing, for want of a better term. I mean, people don't have a picture of it. We think of just a boat with men on board, making a living, bringing in fish that we get to eat. We don't know what's going down there. So I think you've described certain forms of fishing, like trawling, is the equivalent of bulldozing a rainforest for the sake of eating a few songbirds. So help people understand, these nets have like a metal boom. Is that the right
term?
On
the sides,
a boom.
yeah.
How wide is that boom?
It depends. They're little trawls and they're humongous trawls. Some have a span, they're likened to having two 747 passenger aircraft side by side. I mean, this is like a football field.
So you imagine a net the size of a football field. So it's this big mouth
that just
drags along the floor of the ocean.
And the fish just They try to get away, but they can't. They can't outswim the speed of the net as it is drawn by these highly mechanized trawlers.
And the fish that escape the net, they're still the entire plant or coral
Everything,
system or whatever
there.
that they may have depended on may have been wrecked by the net.
Absolutely. You leave death and destruction behind. That's what deep sea mining is poised to do on the ocean floor, thousands of feet beneath the surface.
So we shouldn't say trawling. We should say we're bulldozing the ocean for calories. Doesn't sound that smart when you put it that way.
And it's not sustainable. We talk with great hope about sustainable fishing, but I have to say I have yet to see anything that convinces me that large-scale extraction of ocean wildlife can be done on a sustainable basis, period.
So in addition to the sort of trawling form of fishing, I mean, there's many other forms of fishing, destructive fishing that you hate to see. You've spoken a couple of times about bluefin tuna. I mean, there the issue is just that we are relentlessly going after an incredibly rare and an incredibly spectacular, by the way, species. I mean, I wish everyone in the world could almost like go to Monterey Aquarium and stand in front of it, look at these magnificent creatures swimming round. They are extraordinary.
And you catch them looking at you. You think that they're just like little robots. No, they're curious about you too.
I mean, they're huge and they're blazingly fast as well. They're just astonishing creatures. I mean, do you think that if people had just much more visibility of what it was that they were eating, I mean, maybe it wouldn't make any difference. Kids know what a little lamb looks like, a little pig looks like. They still eat pork.
That's why I want people to... I take people off the street sometimes. You got to go diving. You got to go see for yourself, or at least go to an aquarium. If you don't know, Chris, you can't care. Yeah. And we haven't understood that the ocean is more than just rocks and water with fish swimming around.
So talk about how. I mean, there may be some people out there who are prepared to forswear fish altogether. As people who are advocating for more vegans in the world know, that's a long sell, and that there's progress being made, but it's a long sell to get there. Suppose someone said, I can't give up seafood altogether, but I want to do better. What would you say to them? How should they think about what food they should absolutely forswear off? And what do you forgive them for continuing to eat?
What doesn't make sense when you think about it, and people should think about it, eating carnivores, eating animals that have eaten other animals that have eaten other animals. First of all, there's a big bite out of the ecosystem to make that possible. We don't raise lions and tigers to eat. And if you gave everyone on the planet his or her very own bluefin tuna, there wouldn't be enough to go around. I mean, they're the top predators. When you think about, they have a role in the natural ecosystems. They just do. But we should look at the plant-eating fish that are out there that are already very effectively and efficiently feeding people. In China, for 1,000 years, they've been raising in ponds carp, not just one species, but multiple species with multiple appetites for different kinds of plants. And it works. They feed a lot of people with a small area, with a pond, with ducts on the surface that fertilize the water, that cause the plants to grow, that cause the fish to eat, and around the edge to soak up more of the nutrients that the fish are generating and the ducks are generating. You've got mulberry trees that produce silkworms. You've got a garden with all other forms of vegetables. You've got an efficient little powerhouse. But, we have to think about our choices, not our needs, but our choices. And I think we have to distinguish, Chris, between that which we need for food and that which we choose because we like it that way. It's a luxury, if you will. The basic thing is, to feed people, we do not have to consume wildlife.
Well, let's talk about your campaign to do something very specific, which is to really take on head on this problem of industrial scale fishing and to create what you've called hope spots.
Well, one of the tools in our box is to deliberately say, this place we're going to keep intact. Early in the 20th century in North America, we began protecting national parks with that attitude in mind. Yes, we're going to log trees. Yes, we're going to have agriculture over this large area. But this place, the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, the Smoky Mountains, these places around North America evolved over time to be a network of parks. So the idea that in the ocean, we could replicate that idea of protecting space, a place that we agree is of particular value, breeding areas, feeding areas, nursery areas, places that are highly productive, like seagrass meadows, mangrove forests along the shore, marshes, coral reefs that are like a jeweled belt all around the tropical parts of the planet.
So these marine protected areas, it involves the government basically saying, you may not fish here. There are sometimes exceptions for sort of local traditional fishing, but certainly not for industrial scale fishing. What's an example of a protected area that you've seen working and you've seen the evidence of,
Right.
of it has actually been effective?
Well, hope spots, we have now, Chris, more than 100 places. I think 112 at last count. We're
112 protected areas.
No, they're
No.
hope spots. Some of them are protected.
If they're not protected, what are they?
They're places where the local communities, the people, have made a commitment to use their powers of communication, of gathering data. We've developed a relationship with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, the oldest conservation organization in the world. IUCN enlists thousands of volunteer scientists from around the world, and we're working with them to review applications that people are making. I want this place. We'd like to make this a hope spot. That doesn't mean that it gets protection, but what you've motivated is people all along this area to say, I am going to use my power to get kids out in the water. I'm going to use my power to document who lives here. We're going to do an inventory, and we'll put this data and the photos and the stories up on our website. We're building a constituency of hope, a network of hope. We hope that it will lead to full protection, but the main thing is we've tried to counter this ignorance, this complacency by getting people to identify places they know matter, and then to commit, whether it's in Indonesia or China or in South Africa, all around the world, these little lights are going on.
Have you seen instances where nature has rebounded?
Absolutely. I mean, it does. And there's
me an
one example
example.
everybody uses, but I'll just put it out there, where the fishermen came together. This was not because of us, but we gave them a voice and exposure. It is a hope spot, Cabo Pomo in the Gulf of California in Mexico. And the fishermen saw what fishermen everywhere are seeing, that they have to go further and further offshore to get fewer and fewer fish. And they succeeded in getting the government, in the end, to officially declare it's a relatively small area, but it has a big impact. You find fish that are prospering there that go 10 miles down the coast. You don't see the big grouper. You don't see the sharks, and you don't see the recovering reefs that were diminished because of overfishing. All over the world now, the people are using their local power. I mean, it's the legal fishing that I worry about the most. We have policies that are based on perceptions from the past that haven't caught up with the reality of the present. We thought that the ocean could continue to produce. We could take whatever we wanted, put anything into the ocean that we wanted, and we haven't really brought into alignment the what we can do and what we shouldn't be doing if we want the planet to be a healthy place where we can exist.
Tens of millions of the world's poorest people actually make their living from fishing. And some organizations have argued that those people are key to ensuring a form of protection or ensuring a rebound.
Of course,
And
they
that-
see the
and that
value.
There is a way,
Yeah.
that there is a way to recruit them. And so there's this idea
That's what
of,
I do, or that's
of-
what I try to do.
Right. But do you support, like, there's this economic idea of granting that the key to getting people's buy-in many cases is to grant fishers actual formal ownership in the future output, if you like, of their local fishing area, and that is what gives them an incentive to help enforce protection and to help avoid overfishing, because they know that if they are disciplined in the short term, that their fishing area will be bountiful in the long term.
Again, we're talking about using fish as numbers. We're not looking at them as living creatures as a part of an ecosystem that includes humans. But I will say, such techniques are tools in the box. It's one way to bridge from where we are to get to a better place, but it's not universally applicable. In some places it might work, but in other places you'd find the fishermen really up in arms about the concept. So, it's not one size fits all. So I'm open, and I do realize that if you want to work with issues that relate to fish, you work with a fisherman, and you work with industry, you work with corporations, you work with consumers, you work with everyone, you work with governments, you work with everybody to try to find out how do we get our arms around this. And there is one thing that commands much of my time and attention along these lines of getting people to know what they otherwise can't know. And that's getting people in the water and into the deep sea. I would love to have little submarines that we could take you and anybody we want, including kids and presidents and CEOs and fishermen and deep sea miners. Well, let's just go see what it's like down there. Let me take you where I go.
Because that sense of wonder and that what we learn will help turn the tide, if you like, in the debate that humanity is having with itself as to what to do about the future of the oceans.
We have to. If we don't, we'll miss kind of the heart and soul of what Earth is all about.
Yeah.
And we have the capacity to do it. When you think, how many spacecraft are there? How many aircraft are there? How many boats are on the surface of the ocean? How many cars? How many motorcycles? How many submarines? You can count the number of submarines. There are so few. I want to make it easy. I want to make it accessible, not to exploit, but to explore. And we have to do this.
We haven't even had a chance to talk about what in many ways is the most alarming problem of all, which is what a warming planet is doing to the oceans and what the growing amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is doing. Just give us the quick thumbnail on that, Sylvia. Just how the ocean interacts with more CO2 in the atmosphere.
Well, sometimes I'm asked, do I believe in climate change? I say I don't believe or disbelieve. I just look at the evidence. And the evidence is that the ocean drives climate and weather. The ocean shapes planetary chemistry. The ocean takes up much of the carbon dioxide, the excess carbon dioxide that we have lofted into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution a couple hundred years ago. The ocean is where the action is. And it was only at the Paris conference that finally the ocean was even acknowledged as a footnote. But the next climate conference in Chile, coming up this December, the president of Chile is proclaiming this to be a blue climate conference where the ocean is going to figure front and center, because if we fail to take care of the ocean, really nothing else is going to matter with respect to climate. And it does relate to fishing. That's the whole point of talking about fish as blue carbon, more valuable alive in the ocean, taking up carbon dioxide through the food chain, sequestering carbon in the deep sea. This is a system that has evolved long before there were humans, and we've come along and disrupted this system in a few decades.
Help me if my mental model is right on this. Here's how I think of it. It's clear as we think about climate change that the ocean is playing an absolutely key role. One way that it's playing a key role is that it is absorbing a significant part of the excess carbon dioxide that is out there. If it wasn't for the ocean, as we would already be having much higher temperatures on land because there would be more CO2 in the atmosphere, but the ocean is absorbing it. But that carbon buffer is not going to operate indefinitely.
And it has given rise to that other some call it the evil twin of climate change, and that's ocean acidification.
So carbon increases acid in the ocean. How close are we to that in itself, that single factor causing the loss of whole species?
I have said for, I think, 30 years, the next 10 years will be the most important in the next 10,000 years for the decisions we make or fail to make. And every 10 years, I kind of take stock and I say, well, here we are. And it's true, but it's getting more urgent, and we're running out of options. There still are places on the land, freshwater, in the ocean, that we can embrace with care or lose, depending on what we do or fail to do. But we still have time. But every minute counts. And right now, the minutes count more than they ever have in all of human history before. Chris, I'm driven. You know, I hope my body lasts long enough to see me through it, the time that we can get people to see what is there to be seen by anybody. It's not Sylvia Earle has special insight. I just listen and look.
So anyone who cares about climate has to have the ocean right at the center of their mental model. On the one
Front and
hand,
center.
On the one hand, climate is causing real damage to the ocean currently through acidification. On the other hand, the ocean has the capability of making a massive contribution to either slowing down climate change from too much CO2 or potentially releasing additional CO2 into the atmosphere if we're not careful about what we do to all the life that is in the ocean, that is a key part of the carbon sink that has kept this whole show running.
A dead fish releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but a live fish is something that is part of what keeps the carbon in the ocean and ultimately into the deep sea. So we have, over hundreds of millions of years, a system that has finally reached the point that is absolutely right for human beings, and it's taken us a few decades to cut through these systems, mostly in ignorance. But now we know, and we can change what we have been doing to get things back in a more stable kind of harmony.
Tell me honestly, Sylvia, how in that head of yours that's seen everything, you've been living with this for decades. Is there still hope in there, or are you just putting all the pieces together? You're moving away from that you're losing hope in our chances?
Oh, if I lost hope, I would be among those who've given up. And if you give up, it's over. You know, you can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. You can say, nothing I can do, so I might as well just kick back and have a good time with what time I've got left. And that means you are part of the problem. But you can be part of the solution by saying, oh, here's this wide range of problems. I can play music, so I'm going to use my talent to inspire people to change. Or, I have a way with words, and I will use my mighty powers to get people I know and care about, or people I don't care about, but get them to come on board. Or, I am the mayor of a city. I think I can work with the means I have available to me. I mean, or a kid can say, I know what my family is doing, and I think I can get my family to do better. Everybody has the power to do something. No one can do all that needs to be done, but everybody can do something, and it's going to take that. You know, it's the death of 1,000 cuts or the power of 7 billion minds that if we really pull together.
Well, Sylvia Earle, you are an extraordinary inspiration. Thank you for all you've done. And I'm sure that every day that you continue to say what you're saying, there is another young scientist out there, a person out there, a citizen out there who says, you know what, she has a point. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, that's a wrap for this episode. Do consider sharing it with anyone you know who's curious. Please also consider writing a brief review of the TED interview on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Those reviews are influential, and we certainly read every word. If you'd like to learn more about Sylvia's work and what you can do to help, visit the Mission Blue website at mission-blue.org. This show was produced by Sharon Mashihi. Our editorial director is Michelle Quint. Production manager is Roxanne Highlash. Mix engineer, David Herman. And our theme music is by Alison Leighton Brown. Thanks for listening. In our next episode, I talk to Monica Lewinsky. She talks about what it was like to be shamed publicly at 23 years old and how it took her years to find the way forward.
I had very much been trying to run away from who I was. And the reality was that I needed to integrate my history into who I was becoming.
That's next time on The TED Interview.